The small Cessna 172 was flying straight toward the most restricted airspace in America. No radio contact. No flight plan. No transponder signal. Just a tiny dot on the radar screen moving at 120 miles per hour toward Washington, D.C. like it owned the sky. The stories like this give you chills. Subscribe now. This one will leave you speechless. Air traffic control had been trying to reach the aircraft for 20 minutes. Nothing. Dead silence on all frequencies. The plane had appeared out of nowhere over rural Virginia, flying low and fast toward the capital. Every attempt at radio contact had failed. Every protocol had been followed. Now there was only one option left. At exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, two F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed off the runway at Andrews Air Force Base. Their mission was simple and terrifying. Intercept the unknown aircraft. Identify the threat. And if necessary, shoot it down before it could reach its target. Major Jessica Martinez was the lead pilot. 10 years of experience, over 200 combat missions in 3 different war zones, nerves of steel and reflexes like lightning. Her wingman was Captain David Park, younger but equally skilled, the kind of pilot who could thread a needle with a Sidewinder missile if the mission required it. They climbed fast through 15,000 feet, their powerful engines eating up the distance between them and the mystery aircraft. The air traffic controllers were feeding them constant updates. The target was maintaining course and speed. Still no radio response. Still heading straight for the heart of American government. In the Pentagon's Crisis Command Center, generals and intelligence officers watched the drama unfold on massive screens. Phone calls were being made to the highest levels of government. Fighter jets were being scrambled from 3 different bases. The entire eastern seaboard was on high alert. But in that tiny Cessna, flying alone through the afternoon sky, something very different was happening. 73-year-old Margaret Chin was having the flight of her life. She hadn't been in a cockpit for 15 years, not since her husband passed away and she'd sold their little airplane to pay for his medical bills. But today was special. Today marked exactly 50 years since the most important day of her life. Margaret had borrowed this plane from her grandson, who ran a small flight school in Virginia. She told him she wanted to take one last flight, to see the places where her life had changed forever. He'd been worried about her flying alone at her age, but Margaret had smiled and reminded him that she'd been flying since before he was born. What her grandson didn't know, what nobody in her quiet retirement community knew, was that Margaret Chin had once been Captain Margaret Liu of the United States Air Force. The first Asian American woman to fly fighter jets in combat. The pilot who'd broken more barriers than anyone could count. The woman who'd paved the way for pilots like Jessica Martinez to exist. But that was a lifetime ago. Now she was just an elderly grandmother who volunteered at the local library and made the best dumplings in 3 counties. Her military service was something she rarely talked about. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. A tiny elderly woman who needed help reaching the top shelf at the grocery store? A fighter pilot? Impossible. Margaret had planned this flight carefully. She wanted to fly over the Pentagon where she'd once briefed generals about air combat tactics. Over the Air Force Memorial where some of her old squadron mates were remembered. Over the Smithsonian where one of the planes she'd flown was now on display with someone else's name on it. She'd filed a flight plan, of course. But her grandson's old radio had been acting up lately, cutting in and out at random times. She tried to contact air traffic control when she first took off, but the radio had gone completely dead somewhere over Fredericksburg. Being an experienced pilot, she decided to continue the flight visually. The weather was perfect, visibility was unlimited, and she knew these skies like the back of her weathered hand. What Margaret didn't realize was that her transponder had also failed. The little device that should have been broadcasting her aircraft's identification code to every radar screen in the region had gone silent at the same time as her radio. To air traffic control, she'd simply vanished and then reappeared as an unknown aircraft with unknown intentions. She also didn't realize that her planned route was taking her directly through airspace that had been heavily restricted since September 11th. Airspace where unidentified aircraft were considered hostile until proven otherwise. Airspace where shoot first ask questions later wasn't just policy, it was survival. High above her, Major Martinez and Captain Park were closing in fast. Their F-16s could see the small civilian aircraft now, a tiny white speck against the green Virginia countryside. From their altitude, it looked fragile and harmless, like a paper airplane someone had thrown into a hurricane. "Control, this is Falcon 1, Martinez radioed. Visual contact with the target. Single-engine civilian aircraft, appears to be a Cessna 172. No external markings visible. Aircraft is maintaining course toward restricted airspace. Falcon 1, you are cleared to make contact. Standard intercept procedures. Do not allow that aircraft to proceed beyond Checkpoint Alpha. Martinez knew what that meant. Checkpoint Alpha was the invisible line in the sky beyond which deadly force was authorized. Beyond which she would have no choice but to shoot down the tiny plane and whoever was inside it. She descended toward the Cessna, her massive fighter jet dwarfing the small civilian aircraft. Standard procedure called for her to fly alongside the unknown plane, rock her wings to get the pilot's attention, and signal for the aircraft to follow her to the nearest airport for questioning. What she saw when she pulled alongside the Cessna made her blood run cold. The pilot was an elderly Asian woman, probably in her 70s, flying alone. She was wearing a simple blue sweater and had gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a terrorist. She looked exactly like the kind of person who might get confused about where she was flying. But looks could be deceiving. The September 11th attacks had been carried out by people who looked harmless right up until the moment they weren't. Martinez had been trained not to make assumptions based on appearances. The mission came first. American lives came first. Margaret finally noticed the F-16 flying beside her and nearly jumped out of her seat. In all her years of flying, she'd never had a military escort. She waved at the pilot, thinking it was some kind of honor guard, maybe related to a military exercise she didn't know about. Martinez saw the wave and felt her heart sink. The elderly woman looked genuinely friendly, like she was enjoying the unexpected company. There was no sign of fear or guilt or hostile intent. Just an old lady who seemed delighted to see a fighter jet up close. Control, this is Falcon 1. The pilot appears to be an elderly civilian woman. She's waving at me. No apparent hostile intent. Requesting permission to escort her to Reagan National for questioning rather than proceed with hostile action. There was a pause that seemed to last forever. In the Pentagon Command Center, people were arguing about rules of engagement and acceptable risks and political ramifications. An elderly woman or not, the aircraft was still heading for restricted airspace. Still posed a potential threat to national security. Falcon 1 negative. Orders stand. That aircraft cannot be allowed to proceed. Use all necessary means to divert or stop the target. Martinez felt sick. She'd fired missiles at enemy aircraft before, had engaged hostile fighters over Iraq and Afghanistan. But those had been combat situations against armed opponents who were trying to kill her. This was different. This was an old woman who probably just got lost. She tried everything she could think of. She flew in front of the Cessna, waggling her wings dramatically to signal that the plane needed to change course. She positioned herself where the elderly pilot couldn't miss seeing her, pointing repeatedly toward Reagan National Airport. Margaret saw the gestures but didn't understand what they meant. In her day, fighter jets didn't give flying lessons to civilian aircraft. She assumed the pilot was just being friendly, maybe showing off a little for the old-timer in the slow plane. She gave a thumbs up and continued on her planned route. Control, intercept attempts unsuccessful. Target is not responding to visual signals. Requesting permission to fire warning shots. Another pause. Falcon 1, you are cleared for warning shots. 2 rounds, well clear of the target. Martinez armed her guns with a heavy heart. She positioned her F-16 well away from the Cessna and fired 2 20mm cannon rounds into empty air, the bright tracers clearly visible even in daylight. The sound was deafening. Margaret's little plane shook from the shock waves, and she suddenly understood that this wasn't a friendly escort. This was an interception. Someone thought she was a threat. Her mind raced back through decades of military training. She'd been in situations like this before, just from the other perspective. She'd been the one in the fighter jet intercepting unknown aircraft during the Cold War. She knew exactly what was happening and exactly how it would end if she didn't do something fast. Margaret reached for her radio and tried every frequency she could remember. Military aircraft, this is Cessna November 7834 Romeo. I'm not hostile. Repeat, I'm not hostile. I am a retired Air Force pilot on a memorial flight. Please respond. But her radio was still dead. Her words disappeared into electronic silence. Martinez saw the elderly woman working frantically with her radio equipment. The pilot was clearly trying to establish communication, which was a good sign. Hostile aircraft didn't usually try to talk their way out of interceptions. Control, this is Falcon 1. Target pilot appears to be attempting radio contact. No success establishing communication. Requesting further guidance. Falcon 1, you are approaching Checkpoint Alpha in 90 seconds. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Martinez looked at the Cessna again. The elderly pilot was still working with her radio, still trying to communicate. She was also crying. Martinez could see tears running down the woman's face as she frantically tried to make contact with someone, anyone who could help her. Captain Park, flying wingman, came up on the radio. "Lead, I've got an idea. What if we try to physically guide her to a safe landing? Shepherd her down rather than shoot her down?" -2. Orders are clear. We cannot allow that aircraft to proceed. But Martinez was already thinking the same thing. She looked at the crying elderly woman one more time and made a decision that would either save an innocent life or end her military career. "Control, this is Falcon 1. I'm going to attempt a shepherding maneuver. Try to guide the aircraft to a safe landing." Falcon 1 negative. "You do not have authorization for that action." "Control, I'm taking responsibility. This pilot is clearly not hostile. I will not shoot down an elderly civilian without absolute proof of hostile intent." Margaret saw the F-16 move into position directly ahead of her, flying slowly enough for her to keep up. The fighter pilot was clearly trying to lead her somewhere. Margaret understood immediately and followed, grateful beyond words that someone was trying to help rather than harm her. The three aircraft descended toward a small regional airport in Virginia. Martinez led the way, Park flew rear guard, and Margaret followed in her little Cessna like a lost duckling following its mother. As they approached the airport, Margaret's radio suddenly crackled to life. A loose connection had finally made contact. "Military aircraft, this is Cessna November 7834 Romeo. Thank you for your assistance. Please be advised that I am Captain Margaret Liu, United States Air Force retired. Service number 2478931. I was conducting a memorial flight and experienced radio failure. I'm not hostile. Repeat, I am not hostile." Martinez nearly fell out of her cockpit. She knew that name. Every female military pilot knew that name. Captain Margaret Liu had been a legend, one of the first women to break the gender barrier in military aviation. She'd flown combat missions when women weren't supposed to exist in combat roles. She'd paved the way for every woman who'd followed. "Control, this is Falcon 1. Target pilot has identified herself as Captain Margaret Liu, Air Force retired. Requesting immediate verification of service record." The Pentagon computers came alive. Within minutes, they'd pulled up records that hadn't been accessed in decades. Captain Margaret Liu, later Margaret Chen after marriage. Distinguished Flying Cross. Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Combat veteran of 3 conflicts. One of the most decorated female pilots in Air Force history. Falcon 1, this is Control. Identity confirmed. Captain Liu's service record is authentic. She is not, repeat not, a hostile target. Escort her to safe landing and extend all possible assistance. The landing was smooth and professional. Margaret taxied her borrowed Cessna to the parking area, shut down the engine and sat quietly for a moment, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and emotion. Major Martinez and Captain Park landed their F-16s and walked across the tarmac toward the small civilian aircraft. They moved slowly, respectfully, the way soldiers approach a superior officer. Margaret climbed out of the cockpit with some difficulty, her 73-year-old joints protesting the long flight. She straightened her blue sweater, smoothed her gray hair, and walked toward the 2 fighter pilots with the bearing of someone who'd once commanded respect in similar circumstances. Martinez removed her helmet and stood at attention. "Captain Liu, Major Jessica Martinez, United States Air Force. It's an honor to meet you, ma'am." Margaret looked at the young woman in the flight suit, seeing herself from 50 years ago. "At ease, Major. And it's Mrs. Chin now. I gave up that rank a long time ago. Ma'am, with respect, once a captain, always a captain. Your service record speaks for itself." Margaret smiled, the first time she'd smiled since the interception began. "You know, Major, when I was your age, people told me that women didn't belong in fighter jets. That we weren't strong enough, fast enough, or brave enough for combat aviation." She looked at both pilots, Martinez and Park, a Hispanic woman and a Korean-American man. "Look at you two. Everything I fought for, everything my generation struggled to achieve. You're proof that excellence has no gender, no ethnicity, no limitations except the ones we place on ourselves." Captain Park stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why today? Why this flight?" Margaret's eyes grew distant. 50 years ago today, I flew my first combat mission. Over Vietnam in an F-4 Phantom. I was scared to death, but I was also proud to serve. Today, I wanted to remember that feeling one more time." She gestured toward her little Cessna. "My grandson thinks I borrowed his plane to go sightseeing. He doesn't know about my military service. I never talk about it. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway." Martinez felt a surge of emotion. Ma'am, why don't you talk about it? Your story should be told. Young women need to know what you accomplished. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Because I was taught that service is its own reward. That you don't serve your country for recognition or glory. You serve because it's the right thing to do. She looked at the two F-16s sitting on the tarmac, their sleek forms representing decades of technological advancement since her flying days. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to stop being modest about what we've accomplished. The debriefing took several hours. Pentagon officials wanted to understand how a decorated veteran had ended up in restricted airspace without proper clearance. They wanted to know about the radio failure, the transponder malfunction, the series of coincidences that had nearly led to tragedy. But mostly they wanted to hear Margaret's stories. Stories about flying combat missions when women weren't supposed to be in combat. Stories about proving herself every single day in a world that didn't think she belonged. Stories about the price of breaking barriers and the responsibility that comes with opening doors for others. By evening, word had spread throughout the military aviation community. The woman who'd nearly been shot down wasn't just any elderly pilot. She was a pioneer, a legend, someone whose contributions had been largely forgotten by history but whose impact continued to resonate in every woman who wore wings. Major Martinez arranged for Margaret to visit Andrews Air Force Base the next day. Not as a potential security threat but as an honored guest. The base commander wanted to meet her. The female pilots wanted to hear her stories. The Aviation Museum wanted to add her uniform to their collection. Margaret agreed, but on one condition. She wanted to bring her grandson. It was time he learned about his grandmother's real story. The next morning, 24-year-old Tommy Chin couldn't believe what he was hearing. His quiet, humble grandmother who baked cookies and volunteered at the library had once been a combat pilot? Had flown fighter jets in 3 different wars? Had broken barriers and changed military aviation forever? Grandma, he said, looking at the displays of her medals and commendations, why didn't you ever tell me? Margaret smiled and put her arm around his shoulders. Because I didn't want to live in the past. I wanted to be your grandmother, not a museum exhibit. But people should know. Other women should know what you did. Major Martinez, who'd arranged the visit, overheard them talking. Mrs. Chen, your grandson is right. There are young women in flight training right now who need to hear your story. They need to know that someone like them succeeded, even when the odds were impossible. Margaret looked around the museum, at the displays honoring military aviators throughout history. Most of the exhibits featured men. Most of the stories were about male pilots and their achievements. Women like her were footnotes if they were mentioned at all. You know what, she said finally. Maybe it is time to tell these stories. Not for recognition but for inspiration. So the next generation knows that barriers exist to be broken. Within 6 months, Margaret Chin had become one of the most sought-after speakers in military aviation. She spoke at the Air Force Academy, at pilot training graduations, at women's leadership conferences across the country. Her story was simple but powerful. A young woman who'd been told she didn't belong had persevered, succeeded, and paved the way for thousands of others. She'd served her country with distinction, raised a family, and lived quietly for decades before fate put her back in the spotlight. But the most important part of her story wasn't about her individual achievements. It was about the responsibility that comes with breaking barriers. The obligation to hold the door open for those who follow. The duty to speak up when someone says, "You don't belong here." Major Martinez stayed in touch with Margaret, visiting whenever her duties brought her to the area. They formed an unlikely friendship, the elderly pioneer and the young pilot carrying on her legacy. Mrs. Chen, Martinez said during one visit, I want you to know that every time I climb into that cockpit I think about you. About what you faced, what you overcame. It makes me a better pilot and a better officer. Margaret patted her hand. That's the point, dear. We don't break barriers for ourselves. We break them for the women who come after us. For the little girls who dream of flying but are told they can't. For the young women who face the same challenges we faced. She looked out at the flight line, where female pilots were prepping their aircraft for training missions. Look at them. 20% of our pilots are women now. When I started, that number was 0. The incident that had nearly ended in tragedy became a turning point. Not just for Margaret, who finally began sharing her story publicly, but for the military as a whole. Her experience highlighted how easily history forgets the contributions of pioneers, especially women and minorities who broke barriers before society was ready to acknowledge their achievements. The Air Force launched an initiative to document the stories of forgotten pioneers. To interview aging veterans whose contributions had been overlooked. to ensure that future generations would know the full story of military aviation, not just the parts that had been traditionally celebrated. Margaret became the face of that initiative. Her photograph, in uniform from 50 years ago, was displayed alongside current female pilots in recruiting materials. Her story was told in training courses about military heritage and tradition. But she never let the attention go to her head. She remained the same humble, gracious woman who'd borrowed her grandson's airplane for a memorial flight. The same woman who'd nearly been shot down because someone forgot to remember her. The F-16 pilots who'd intercepted her that day, Martinez and Park, were both promoted within the year. Not because of the incident, but because their handling of a potential crisis had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character the Air Force wanted in its leaders. They'd been faced with an impossible choice: follow orders and potentially kill an innocent person, or risk their careers to save a life. They'd chosen compassion over compliance, humanity over procedure. And in doing so, they'd prevented not just a tragedy, but the loss of a living piece of aviation history. Margaret lived for another 8 years after that incident, long enough to see the first female Air Force Chief of Staff take command. Long enough to witness the barriers she'd helped break disappear entirely for new generations of pilots. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family and friends who'd learned to see her not just as a grandmother or neighbor, but as a woman whose courage had changed the world in small but important ways. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Military pilots, both male and female, came from across the country to pay their respects. The F-16 pilots who'd once been ordered to shoot her down served as honorary pallbearers. Major Martinez, now a colonel, delivered the eulogy. She spoke about courage that doesn't announce itself, about service that expects no recognition, about the quiet heroism of people who break barriers not for glory, but because someone has to go first. Margaret Chin lived 2 lives, Martinez said. The first is Captain Margaret Liu, a pioneer who proved that women belonged in military aviation. The second is Mrs. Chin, a grandmother who taught us that heroism isn't always about what you did yesterday. Sometimes it's about what you inspire others to do tomorrow. The little Cessna that had carried Margaret on her final flight was restored and donated to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. It sits there now, next to the fighter jets flown by famous male pilots, with a placard that tells Margaret's story. Visitors often pause at that display, struck by the contrast between the tiny civilian aircraft and the massive military fighters surrounding it. They read about the elderly woman who'd been mistaken for a terrorist, about the F-16 pilots who'd chosen mercy over protocol, about the near tragedy that became a celebration of unsung heroes. And sometimes, if you listen carefully in that museum, you can hear the echo of Margaret's words: "We don't break barriers for ourselves. We break them for the ones who come after us. Because that's what heroes do. They open doors that others said should stay closed. They prove that excellence has no limitations except the ones we accept. And they remind us that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names we never learn. Until the day when F-16s intercept their tiny plane, and the world discovers that heroes have been hiding in plain sight all along." If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. There are more incredible true stories of unsung heroes waiting for you. Click the next video and let me know in the comments. Have you ever met someone whose quiet heroism changed your life?